genital mutilation, how it's still rampant in many parts of the country. You know, everything that's happened there, do you think this is for the first seeds to try and change that, or is some of this stuff so entrenched in your culture that you don't know if it'll ever, you know, be wiped out?
Mm-hmm. No, it's absolutely not entrenched in the culture. I think that there simply wasn't an interest. I mean, like I said, the regime was invested in one thing, and that was staying in power. So anything that could be neglected pretty much was, including Egypt's own role in foreign policy matters. As sort of developmentally we started to regress on every level, they became more and more obsessed with patching a crisis here, a Band-Aid there, but no systematic vision forward, and especially not for the most vulnerable groups, which would include minorities and women. There is a National Council for Women that was headed by the former First Lady. They tried, not the most serious group in the world. They did try with some public awareness campaign, and they did finally outlaw the practice some years ago. But what that did, it did alleviate some things, but in some ways it created a bigger problem, which was drive families to do the practice in their homes or in barbershops rather than in hospitals. So before, when it was legal, you could at least do it in a clean environment. After it became illegal, it was driven outside and much less safe. It's a crisis, really. The UN, I think, puts the percentage of Egyptian women that are genitally mutilated at, I believe, 92%, which is just staggering. The impact of it is not just the physical trauma, but psychological trauma that lasts for life. I believe that these various human rights crises, I think, became exacerbated with the overall democracy deficit, the overall absence of respect for human rights and a human rights culture. I think that what's critical moving forward is that civil society has a role. And in civil society, Egypt has been blessed that despite all of the restrictions that have come from the government for years and years, despite all of that, there is a quite vibrant civil society and a number of fabulous women's groups who are, like I said, not taking anything for granted and already moving forward. So I think that generally, if we succeed in changing the environment and making it more free and more democratic, instill respect for human rights through educational, through reforming education and through reforming the media, that'll be one thing. We're going to also have to enshrine this in all of our laws. And if we want women to have a more prominent role, we should also consider moving to a proportionate system for parliament and including a very significant quota for women. Mubarak did instill a quota for women, which was 64 seats, I believe, in a body that was over 400 members. Not very meaningful, and that, of course, was also abused in order to grant more seats to the ruling party, to his party. So again, not very meaningful at all. So in moving forward and in figuring out what we want to do, how we want to reform our constitution, we should seriously give thought to a quota system on the national level and on the local level as well. Some of the local legislative bodies have just been the worst as far as corruption. So that's the thing. These human rights crises, I think, are intimately linked to the overall democratic trajectory of the country. That's what civil society groups are going to have to be vigilant over this. They're going to have to be part of the transition, demand freedoms, demand that their freedoms are enshrined in law, and also think somewhat creatively about what we can do institutionally to advance the place of women in society, and also just to alter mindsets. You don't undo not just 30 years, but really 60 years of absolute autocracy and regression on every front in a matter of 1 or 2 years. This is going to be a lot of long work ahead, but it needs to start now, and I think that women's groups are already starting it now.
As long as they can keep the fire going, I guess, right? That would be the big thing. I'm just going to switch gears a little bit, Nelofer. I mean, one of my joyous times in Kabul has always been outside the school, you know, when the bell goes off and the door flings open and just hundreds of schoolgirls come racing out of there, and they're all laughing. You all got their black and white uniforms on, which you know in that. What worries me, though, is because I've done too many stories now on possible talks with the Taliban there, between the Karzai government and the Taliban as a way, to get the U.S. out and that type of thing. And the fear, of course, being that if the Taliban do come back into power, what does this do for women's rights? And I know Secretary Clinton has worked very hard on this, and it must be tough. I mean, is this something that you're concerned about?
Well, I think a lot of people are concerned about it, and that's not just the only one. I usually like to say I break it into two levels, as I earlier mentioned, in relation to what's happening as well in the rest of the Arab Muslim world. You see, there's an aspect of sort of the political system, which we think we have some systems of governance in place, and even if it is semi-democratic, I also am not one of those people who's going to believe that immediately we're going to jump, like in the case of Afghanistan, from a situation where the infrastructure is being so diminished to a full democratic process. I think it's 10 years now in Afghanistan, and we're only discovering some of the flaws and problems that we hadn't even thought about 10 years ago when we went in, or the world kind of arrived at the doorsteps of Afghanistan a little bit shocked and aware of what they were going to encounter. And we're still struggling with that. One of the things that has been going on in the country, of course, because especially when you think of Afghanistan, women's issues comes right to the forefront, because a lot of times under the Taliban, how the women were treated and how they were deprived. Our immediate sense, I remember, like after September 11, not exactly maybe in the same situation like the revolution in Egypt, but the expectations were that immediately everything's going to be different now. Everything's going to be, and I've had people asking me questions and saying, how come these women are still wearing their burqas, their covers, Now you're a free country. But there is a word from the time that you like to believe, either by the media or your perception, that what freedom is, to the point where you actually see down on the ground. I think she as well mentioned in reference to you could have laws and legal systems and a number of things in place. It doesn't mean a lot for the women, especially in the context of Afghanistan, where they had been deprived from basic rights. Even before the Taliban, they did not have full rights, although the constitution of previous governments had guaranteed women's rights. The literacy is so low, even 10 years after such efforts about education and the schools, it's still about 28% of society can read and write. And the smallest percentage is, of course, women. So considering that we're already in a very dire situation, you start the discussion about the return of the Taliban. A lot of women groups in Afghanistan, most of just organic local Afghan groups, nothing to do really with the West or Western agenda, are very worried, because they're thinking, well, hold on a second, we haven't even found our full freedom yet. And all of a sudden we're going to be pushed back again. And although the Taliban have been making statements in terms of saying they're going to make some changes to their ideology, they're going to grant. One of the things they came out very recently and said, we will allow for the education of girls. But the word education is very suspect, because what do we mean by education? For us in the West, education means either it's co-education, it's books, schools, science, libraries, labs. But for the Taliban, education could mean anything to do just with religious and their version of it. And it does not encompass anything else. Because one of the things that they did when they went in Kabul is they went to schools, they burned libraries, and they crashed all labs where anything to do with scientific development was in existence. So although they're making that kind of statements, but everybody, including myself, were very suspicious of what does it mean. And I think it will be such an unfortunate setback. Because how can you, they're already causing a lot of, the insurgents as we're calling them, are causing a lot of trouble right now. We are, for example, Canada has been involved in building of a number of schools, in fact about 50 in plan. I just got back from Kandahar, where in Panjwari district, that used to be a very strong Taliban place, there've just been a recent opening of a school for young kids. They're waiting for a month and trying to get the locals to send their kids to school. I'd go to their homes, and the young kids would say, we like to go to school. Their mothers would say, oh, I like my boys and girls to go to school. But the fathers are scared, because they're saying, well, if I send them to school tomorrow, if the Taliban come back, they'll probably knock at my door, and I will get in trouble. So there is still that sense of fear. On the one hand, they're causing this kind of a block towards education, towards any change, especially including anything to do with women. You know, I just arrived from a city where you walk about and you don't see a single woman's face. So when you consider that, and then on the top of it, if we want to engage them to come and join the government and set policies, how on earth they're going to respect the rights of women or even young girls to education? And again, that education would be very particular. You can study this, but not that. You know, when I look at your work of talking about domestic violence and abuse, and I just kept thinking, oh my God, it will be such a bright day if there was a single shelter in Afghanistan that could help women who are suffering from domestic violence. You know, there's the Human Rights Independent Commission in Kandahar. There's a very brave woman there that puts the burqa on and goes and deals with these issues every day. Her own husband is a very conservative man, but she's fighting for, you know, whatever that she can do. And she kept saying, look, I just, as a one person, I can't even begin to listen to all the stories, let alone to actually record it and to present it to the world. So, you know, I mean, I look at what's happening in the Muslim world and I feel optimistic in a sense that, yes, that, especially if it's happening in the Muslim world, it gives it a sense of legitimacy for a conservative country like Afghanistan, where the man would look and say,